Well, hello. I'm really frugal. I know I've been accused of being just the opposite, but in all honesty, if I buy or spend money on an expensive tool, I really feel an internal obligation to use that tool as much as possible. And even though a newer option might present itself down the road, I try to get the life out of that tool or accessory or whatever it is I'm talking about. And I try to get the life out of that thing before I decide to replace it. Some people are just the opposite. They'll buy, for example, an expensive tool or an expensive accessory for their motorcycle. They'll use it for a while. If something better goes out, they'll immediately go out and replace that old tool with a new one, even though the old tool might still have function left in it. Well, about, I don't know, about 7 or 8 years ago, I bought one of these Phoenix brake bleeding systems. And this system worked very well. It's a reverse brake bleeder, and essentially what it does is when you're bleeding the brakes on your motorcycle or your clutch, if it uses brake fluid, or I guess if it uses oil too, when you're bleeding these hydraulic systems, essentially what you're doing is getting all the air out of the system. And what Phoenix proposes is that if you pump fluid from the bottom upwards, you're forcing air up the natural tendency it wants to go anyway, as opposed to sucking it down with a conventional bleeder. Even a compressor-powered bleeder creates vacuum to suck everything down out through the bleed nipple down at the caliper. That works fine. They propose that pushing is easier and quicker. That makes a lot of sense too. I used this particular bleeder for several years. However, about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, and these have been on the market for a while, 3 or 4 years ago, somebody really convinced me to try these SpeedBleeders by SpeedBleeder. So basically, these are replacement bleed nipples for your calipers that essentially have a check valve inside. And what you do, as opposed to when you're bleeding, as opposed to opening and closing, this check valve does the opening and closing for you. And it simplifies the bleeding process. But when you use them, you realize how quick it is, even compared to a bleeder. Reverse bleeder or conventional bleeder, a vacuum bleeder or a reverse bleeder. These things are a heck of a lot quicker than those as well. I bought them for my K16, if you've seen that video where I serviced them. And I was so impressed. That was, I've had them on dirt bikes before, but on the street bikes, I traditionally used the bleeder, because I thought there's such a volume of fluid that needs to be moved through, that would be quicker. But these here have turned out to me to be much quicker. Now, these aren't expensive. These are $6 each. So I have 3 of them for the bike, obviously. And I opted for another $6. I bought this here bleed bag to hook up to this to help the whole process. So I get $28 worth of gear here that'll serve this bike for the rest of its life, quite honestly. And what I thought I'd do is show you how quickly these things are, how quickly I can install these things, or you can install them, and how it makes the whole bleeding process so quick and so painless, and so easy for anybody to do, because it reduces, you don't need to go out and spend a couple $100 on a bleeder. Use this $21 or $26 investment and you're good to go for the life of the bike. Now, bleeding your brakes, how often do you do that? Well, BMW, for example, recommends you do it after the first year of ownership and then every 2 years thereafter. However, other kinds of motorcycling where you're getting high wear on the fluid. Now, wear on the fluid is actually high exposure to any kind of moisture, heat, and that sort of thing. You may have to bleed them more often. So this just expedites that process for you. However, even for this bike, I'll probably own this 3 or 4 years, because that's usually how long I keep a bike for. Maybe longer, who knows. This will make that next bleed, which is one of the longer things you have to do in a regular service, make that bleed portion of the service so much quicker. So watch how quickly it is. Watch how quickly I can switch these nipples out. So there's just one footnote on this install, or any install with SpeedBleeders. If you are installing them on a dry system, or system that has not been primed or filled yet with fluid, these won't work. Okay, so they cannot be installed on a fresh system. Perhaps you've changed your brake lines, or perhaps you've completely replaced your braking system or constructed a new braking system, and the system has no fluid in it. These won't work for you because air does not, you cannot develop enough pressure on air to get that check valve to release. You need fluid there. The fluid is a direct, when you squeeze that grip at the bars, it pushes almost 100% of your pressure right down that line on this thing, and out it goes. But air is so spongy, this won't work. So what you'd have to do is get the system filled with a conventional bleed nipple. Once you're up there and you get enough pressure in the grip or the bars or the lever, then you can install one of these and finish the bleeding process. So to start is I get a rag handy. We're working around brakes here, and it goes without saying that if this fluid drips down onto the calipers, or worse, into the pads, the brake pads, if you can get that out, and quite often you can, especially the pads, their compound tends to soak the brake fluid up. They'll never stop properly. You'd have to replace the pads, and you'd have to scrub down this caliper with some brake cleaner or some sort of solvent to clean that off. So you really got to be careful. And for that reason, get a nice clean rag and keep it handy for what you're about to do. So first things first is take off the rubber boot off the stock nipple. Here it is. So now, before we get underway, here's what's going to happen. We're going to undo this here nipple with an 8mm wrench. I'm going to spin it out. Now, as long as nobody grabs the lever up above, that fluid will just slowly dribble out of the hole we create. So get a couple seconds, we'll pull this out, put the new one in, tighten it down, just by finger tight until it bottoms out, and we're done until the next step. So we don't have to worry about a bunch of fluid squirting out. It doesn't. It'll just slowly ooze or seep out of this, okay? Here we go. Once I loosen it up with the wrench, I can just finish it with my fingers. I keep the rag right underneath that boss that screws into. You notice there's no fluid coming out there. I get my new one, and in it goes. Now, the new one has some thread compound on it. So it's a little resistant. You got to use a wrench just to keep it going. It's just a little too resistant to use your finger tight alone. And that thread compound is not thread locker, it's more of a thread sealant. And it's a special sealant that kind of acts to mold to the receiver threads and seals the two components together. So I'm using very little pressure here to turn that. And once that bottoms out, we're done. There, it's bottomed out. No need to tighten it. That's it. That is closed. Now, this particular Speedbleeder, this particular brand because there's other brands besides Speedbleeder, but this particular brand of check valve bleed nipple, they just say, bottom it out, you're done, that's closed. Unlike a conventional one, we have to tighten it to a torque spec, actually put a little twist on it. These ones they recommend just bottom them out and it's closed. When you want to open it, you just open it up a quarter turn, okay, with a wrench obviously. So just bottom that out. If you find after the install there's a tiny bit of wetness around where the threads are, then give it just at the very most a 1/16 of a turn tighten with the wrench. So you just touch it, just about from here to here, just a little bit of strength and you're done. Now watch how easy this is to bleed. Now that I have that in, I'm going to take my bleed bag here. I'm going to show you how easy this is to bleed. This bleed bag, or IV bag as they call it, has a pipe, a firm pipe coming out of it that hooks onto this soft squishy bag provided by Speedbleeder that I bought for $3. And then I put the other end on the nipple, like so. Once that's on there, I'm done down here. I open up open up the nipple, it's bottomed out, so I just loosen it up. About a quarter turn. We're good to go. Watch this. Look at that. See that fluid coming out there and then I'm pumping it? There's a bubble. I pumped about 6 or 7 times. No bubbles. And, oops. Tighten it just till it bottoms out. Closed. We're done. Keep everything down. And it comes with a little boot, which you should use, this rubber boot, because this is a little more complicated than the conventional nipple. You want to put that rubber boot on there to protect that mechanism inside. You're done. It's that easy. Now, while you are done, you're not done. You do this side, you do the other side, then we top up the fluid up top because I've pumped some out of the reservoir now. I want to make sure I'm still okay on my level up top. That's it. Now, as I move to the back under horrible lighting for the camera, sorry about that, it's important to note that all 3 bleed nipples for this particular bike are different sizes. So as you line up which bleed nipple to go where, refer to your documentation that came with the nipples or compare the sizes of the stock nipples on the bike before you get underway. Now, one thing to keep in mind about the power bleeders, whether it's a Mityvac vacuum bleeder or a Phoenix reverse bleeder, those tools still have their place in your workshop. If you have one, don't get rid of it. These SpeedBleeders, as wonderful as they are, they don't replace a conventional bleeder. However, one thing to keep in mind, if you do have a Phoenix bleeder, which is a reverse flow bleeder, it injects the fluid at the caliper to fill the system from below. It will not work with SpeedBleeders. The check valve specifically prevents fluid or air or anything from going back up the system. Now, brake fluid is toxic stuff and it's corrosive, so make sure you wear gloves when you work around this stuff, and also wear eye protection if need be. And if you happen to spill any on your bike or on the floor or on anything else, make sure you clean it up right away. It will eat through paint. And speaking of safety, these are your brakes you're working on. So the disclaimer is this: you work on your brakes at your own risk. I showed you what I've done, but if you decide to do this, you work on your brakes at your own risk. Anytime you work on your brakes, be very diligent and slow and specific and deliberate in how you work around them. Follow the rules to the letter, and that will definitely reduce your chance of having any problems. Additionally, after you bleed your brakes and you seal everything up and clean it up and put the boots back on the nipples, make sure you pump your brakes to build pressure back up before you take your bike out for a ride. And on that note, it's time for me to go for a ride. So until next time.